Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of our guests and visitors and participants in this very special book club discussion of Tom Friedman's Thank You for Being Late. My name is Mark Ritchie, and I have the honor of serving as president of Global Minnesota. And today's book club is a partnership with the Blandin Foundation and the Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development's Broadband Development Agency. This is in conjunction with a conference that's coming up. You'll be hearing about this from Bernadine at the annual conference looking at broadband development in our state, in Minnesota. But it's part of the larger, how are we bringing the world in a way closer together by making sure we are connected together. So you'll be hearing more about that. I'm very pleased to bring this program today on behalf of the members of Global Minnesota. We're a 70-year-old organization that's been connecting Minnesotans to the world and the world to Minnesota. And in doing so, it gives us the opportunity to sometimes dive deeper into perspectives, into ideas, actions. And today's particular opportunity to look at the book of one of Minnesotans' most well-known and really one of its most, in my experience, beloved international voices is a great opportunity and privilege. Your memberships, those of you who are members, support this kind of programming, making it free and available now globally, thanks to the new technology. For those of you who aren't members but would like to join, we would love to have your participation. Your support would help bring this programming to more people. But if you'd like just background and information, check out our website at globalminnesota.org. For those of you who are watching by way of the YouTube, you can see down below in the bottom of your screen a description. There's a way for you to submit questions or comments. The email for that is questions with an S at globalminnesota.org. For those of you joining us on the Zoom portal, the platform, you'll see the little chat button at the bottom. So we'll have opportunity for interaction and conversation. I'm thrilled that I'm joined today in helping lead and facilitate this book club. My friend and colleague, Bernadine Joslin, who serves as the officer at the Blandin Foundation for Public Policy and Community Engagement. Bernadine's life experience has taken her all over the world, was a diplomat for the US government in Russia, in Moscow, then worked for the Eurasia Foundation. Bernadine came back to Minnesota. We ended up both being at the Humphrey School, School and Public Policy at the University of Minnesota. She really took international affairs seriously and got another master's right before then at Columbia. But she's been the lead on Blandin Foundation's work in bringing revitalization and really a future orientation to Minnesota's rural communities. And in my work at the Minnesota Department of Agriculture many years ago, Blandin Foundation's commitment to strengthening our rural economy, our rural communities, has been very long, very deep, and very, very effective. And Bernadine has been leading that into the future. And so I'm thrilled to invite her to join today. And Bernadine, I'm turning the microphone over to you.
Thank you, Mark. And hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I love that nod, Mark, to the fact that we have a global theme today and a global reality. And Tom's book about Thank You for Being Late is a great lens for us to bring to what's going on today in Minnesota and around the world. And I'm so proud to be a Minnesotan and to have Global Minnesota representing us and your aspirations to make us a more international and interconnected state, something I've admired for a long time. There's a lot of threads here today, Mark, that we're going to be weaving together. It's really fun at this intersectionality of politics and economy and development. And I'm reminded of, you nodded to our history together. Mark, you and I first met when you were at, as you mentioned, at the Institute for Trade and help me out.
Agriculture and Trade Policy.
That's right, Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. And at that time, Tom Vellenga was worked for you, an assistant, and I'll never forget. I roared in one morning and met Tom, and he'd just been in your office, Mark, for 20 minutes, and he said he came out after a 20-minute conversation with you with 2.5 pages, single-space line of ideas that it was his job to go and implement. You are an idea generator. It's true that I lived and worked abroad for many years as a diplomat in Russia and in India. And when I got back to Minnesota in 2001, I joined the staff at Blandin Foundation, where I've been working ever since, leading up their public policy and engagement program. Blandin Foundation is Minnesota's largest rural-based philanthropy, and our mission is to strengthen rural Minnesota communities. And that is the lens that brought us to, as a foundation, work on broadband access and adoption. Because at Blandin Foundation, we recognized that everything that we care about as a foundation, place-based, focusing on rural communities, is better with broadband. I like to say everything's better with better broadband. And we've certainly experienced as a state and as a nation in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, how truly critical broadband is for access and adoption and just full participation in our modern economy. I often say that access denied is opportunity denied, and opportunity is the ticket in America, what we're trying to offer everybody. And so we have been working for many years at the foundation to try to help rural communities get and use the broadband that they need to survive and thrive in our modern interconnected economy. And for many years now, to help try to catalyze the conversation and the learning and the hard work that it takes to get broadband across our state, Blandin Foundation has been privileged to co-host, along with the Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development, an annual broadband conference where we try to bring together people across the state that care about this topic, that figure out that we're the ones that have got to get it done. Nobody's coming to save us. If you don't have a broadband network in your small community today, you're not going to get it unless you make it happen, because it's an example of market failure, that if it hasn't been built yet, it's because it's hard to do, it's not profitable, and it's going to take some public policy solution. That's what we talk about at our annual conference. And this book club, this fun partnership between Blandin Foundation, Minnesota's largest rural-based philanthropy, and Global Minnesota, is a part of our annual broadband conference this year. The conference is called Connected We Stand, Broadband 2020, Connected We Stand. And the pandemic has disrupted all of our lives in many ways, but one of the bright sides of the pandemic, that it has underscored how modern technology does connect us in new and vital ways. And because of that, we had the audacity at the Blandin Foundation and at DEED to reach out to Tom Friedman, Minnesota's most probably renowned native son. Tom Friedman is a 3-time Pulitzer Prize winning author, New York Times columnist, and we'll hear more about him from Mark. But he, son of Minnesota, grew up in St. Louis Park and in rural Minnesota. And his book that we'll be talking about today talks a little bit about the role of community. So Tom agreed to keynote our conference. And next, on the 29th of October, and I think Ann put in the chat box the date, he will be keynoting, talking about his view of the role of communities in the 21st century. And so this book club idea, Mark and I cooked up as a way to kind of get our minds focused on some of the thoughts and ideas and key themes in Tom's book, so that we would be a very ready and prepped audience when we engage with him next week when he comes back virtually to Minnesota to keynote our broadband conference. So that's kind of the context for today. We've had events all across the month of October. in our attempt, just like Global Minnesota has been pivoting and trying to respond, figure out how can we do our work when our work is getting people together and we can't get together anymore. How do we do that? So we really are grappling with a lot of the challenges that Mr. Friedman talks about in his book. But the conference is this is our week 3, so we've dispersed it across the whole month of October. We'll have in the chat box links to where you can check out some of the other content we've been talking about all month about how to get and use the broadband we need to thrive and survive as a state. And hope to see after this warm-up conversation with us today about the book, an opportunity to visit and hear from Tom Friedman directly next week. So with that context and introduction, Mark, I'll turn it back to you, and maybe we could hear a little bit more about your connection to Tom, and we can begin talking through some of the themes in the book.
Yes, thank you so much, Bernadine. And this this amazing book that we picked for this particular one, of course, it's just one of many, and all of his books seemingly have been prescient in the sense that the look that he made about the Middle East is so important today, and his examination, the world is flat, just what is going on with the transformation in the economy. But what I was struck by, and I was just kind of thrilled to be brought back to this book of his about Thank You for Being Late, was the way that I began to understand Tom Friedman's role inside of the broader sort of internationalization of ideas and values that I would say very personally call kind of Minnesotan values and Midwestern values. But we were, working hard to bring our proposal to host a World's Fair to Minnesota, and the State Department in Washington was inviting in every ambassador in the whole Washington, D.C. area, every single one, to hear about that. And they decided that Thomas Friedman's description of Minnesota, the description in the book about St. Louis Park and Willmar and others, was the very best way for our story to be told. And, I hadn't really thought about that because, I had read his book a little bit more about, his appreciation of the pause, as he called it, when he was thanking somebody for being late, giving him a few minutes to think. But Thomas Friedman and I ended up being the presenters. He kind of gave the big picture and I talked about ours. But I could see in the comments and questions asked to him and in the buzz around him that he has created for Minnesota, yes, for the New York Times, certainly, but for Minnesota, a kind of presence in the world of a trusted voice that speaks to the emotions and to the heart. And I think this is something that he raises up throughout the book. So that was pretty exciting. So knowing that, I went out and got 10 copies of his book, got him to sign them, and we used those as the special thing that we put on the pillows at the Radisson Blu down at the Mall of America for the 10 ambassadors from the whole planet who came to Minnesota to be the site visit, the people to check out our bid for the expo. And all of them, without exception, knew him, had heard of the book, did not have the book, and some of them got and read the book while they were here in Minnesota. So it's just to say that one of our native sons who has gone off and done a lot of things on the planet, first as a reporter, particularly covering the Middle East and international affairs, and then the past few decades as a columnist, has both given the world a picture of Minnesotans, but I would think, and the reason we are so happy about doing this book club today is that it's also helped us in Minnesota to have a way to see part of the world that one of our own who's out there is able to see. And so the book was largely written, in 2014, 2015, when it first came out. 2016 is the edition that I happen to have. Many things have changed in the world. And so I wanted to kind of kick off a conversation. And Bernadine, I think I'm just going to ask it to you directly, and then the chat and the questions at globalmen.org can bring in other voices. But it seems to me that he opens the book with an appreciation for a pause. He's going to meet somebody, that person is late, they make an excuse. He says, no, thank you. You gave me a few moments to stop and think, and he uses the word to pause. And I'm struck by the fact that some are calling the current COVID pandemic moment the great pause, that the acceleration that he describes in the book towards globalization, faster and faster and faster, things are slowed in a completely other way. What do you think, Bernadine? What do you think about the way that he phrased the value of that pause, of that reflection in the context of this moment? Was he putting his finger on something that could give us a different way or different lens to think about the current moment we're in right now?
Yeah, thanks for that great question, Mark. You know, I do think that as a species, maybe that human beings do need to find techniques for coping with this increased acceleration that he talks about in the book. And the four kind of phases that he talks about, with reflection being the grounding, the initial phase, and then reflecting, and then the acceleration, innovation, and anchoring, as he talks about. I think that he really has passed us a lifeline. At Blandin Foundation, we recognize the importance of reflective leadership. And, you know, Mark, I was remembering when I came back to the Humphrey Institute from Moscow, Russia, where I spent a decade in the mid 80s and 90s. At that time at the Humphrey Institute, there was a Center for Reflective Leadership. Do you recall that, Mark? And the
Yes,
whole
yes,
idea
yes,
that
yes.
is a core practice of leaders to take that time to reflect and not be, it's how you can get out in front of the world instead of being reactive all the time, to be able to be proactive in your response, and choose how you respond. I think a call for leaders to be reflective, and call forward the values that they are trying to pursue in their community efforts as a lens to bring on the work is very important. And it's true that the pandemic, when the world was shut down and the airplanes stopped flying, and it almost felt like the globe, the earth itself could breathe, I think it was a reminder to all of us as a species on the planet that nothing is a given, that we all make choices, and that we have the power to create our own reality, that we as human beings have that responsibility and that opportunity, and we can, through reflection, make better choices. I think that for me, the key theme in Tom Friedman's book, and I don't mean to get ahead of our conversation, but you know, that really reflection leads to working together for the common good. And I think that's what Friedman is urging us to do in this book, beginning with reflection, is that where are we going to find the best human response to this increasingly accelerating change? And it is by turning to one another and asking what we can do together better that we can't do alone.
So this element of his book, have you seen in this period a way that some of our urban rural, sometimes different paces, different perspective, different emphasis, something in the current moment with some reflective leadership could help us turn towards each other?
I do think that this is a time, an opportunity for a rural renaissance in recentering ourselves on what it is that we care about, what it is that we're trying to do here, what is our project in America, with a kind of a refocus on quality of our relationships and quality of the place that we live in. And so from a rural perspective, just like we talked about how there's been real upsides to the pandemic, I do think that we will come out of this as a nation with a renewed appreciation for the quality of place. And that is, I think, a real theme that Tom Friedman keeps us reminding us all the time, that the work that we have to do in the world, we all need to begin the place where we are at. There's this idea about rural, I think that Norman Rockwell idea about rural, the ideal or idyllic situation. A lot of that has to do with people caring for one another and knowing one another. And I think that's the opportunity that we need to pursue now going forward out of the pandemic.
Well, I want to urge all of the folks who are watching on the Zoom to use the chat. And of course, if you're watching on the YouTube, to use that questions with an S at globalminnesota.org. But I want to note that Blandin Foundation has been working to advance better broadband for decades. And now suddenly it's in a whole nother category, particularly healthcare, telemedicine is suddenly, it's sometimes right now the only way to get some assistance. Many schools, it's the only way that some students and some young people are being connected to learning and to each other and to the broader community. Has this caused, from your perspective, a kind of acceleration? I mean, Tom Friedman was a very interesting choice of somebody to invite back to be your keynote. What are you seeing, and what are you seeing that maybe the rest of us, who've read the book and are thinking about it now, might not have seen?
So I don't know about what I've seen that others might not have seen, but was from our perspective at Blandin Foundation, the theme of I like to often quote Jerry Garcia, who said, somebody's got to do something, and it's just pathetic that it's got to be us. That's the idea.
Remind people who Jerry Garcia is.
And come on. The Grateful Dead, the legendary guitarist Jerry Garcia. It's just pathetic that it's got to be us. And I think that that's a theme that I really admire in Tom Friedman, and why we wanted to bring his voice back to this conference is this idea of agency and ownership, that it's up to us to make the world a better place, especially in small rural places. We're it. And helping people feel efficacious and hopeful is the secret sauce to community change. When I was living and working in Russia, the most discouraging and difficult challenge there to address was people were checked out, cynical, hopeless, and feeling like it didn't matter, that their voice, whatever they did or said or tried to do, would not make a difference. The system was broken. And I think coming back from Russia back to the United States, I've seen that as the most precious asset we have as Americans, is this idea that the quality of our democracy is up to us. And we can and do have an opportunity to make the world a better place, and that it does matter when we speak up. And so that message from Tom, and also the idea that the quality of our connections to one another and to our place is where we find meaning and purpose in the world, is a message that I think is very timely for Minnesota. And because the small rural places that we're working with that don't have broadband, that they got to figure it out themselves. We're hoping that that voice of inspiration will further inspire rural broadband advocates from across the state to keep at it. This is the kind of change that takes time, it takes tenacity, and we're all standing on the shoulders of people who did this work before us. And the internet is not going to just come down from the sky and appear. We have got to build it. It's not just going to come. So I think a key message for me out of this book is that it's up to us, that we do have, if we recognize it, the opportunity and the responsibility to make the world better for everybody. And as another son of Minnesota used to say, Paul Wellstone, we all do better when we all do better. And I think for me, that's the theme of One Minnesota that I'm hoping we can promote through our discussions today and next week when we meet with Tom again.
One of the things that I really loved about the book was the way that he opened it with the story about learning from and sharing what he knew with the parking attendant slash blogger from Oromo region of Ethiopia. And, maybe that was, kind of coincidental, but it's also true that the Oromo community of Ethiopia that lives in Minnesota is a very, very large and very, very organized and a very big contributor to the new Minnesota. And I think that that isn't, widely known necessarily outside of, some community. But I was struck in his description of that, the sort of the first step was the parking attendant slash blogger reaching out saying, hey, I know who you are. I like what you do. I read what you're doing. And then Tom saying, well, I thought about that. That was interesting that the parking attendant knew who he was. But then the conversation went further. Would there be interest in reading my blog? And so in his description of that, he is modeling a kind of quality of relationship that requires some courage, some reaching out. And some of us are extrovert and introvert, so we all come differently wired. But that then led to a deeper reflection. And Tom Friedman made a very significant point about the things that he learned by being asked a question and being thoughtful about how to answer. How do you construct your columns? And he talked about the value, because he said he had never really stopped to think like that. But he also reflected on what he was learning from the conversation. And this part led him to give a kind of overarching explanation about why inclusion of diverse views and diverse perspectives is what he credited that to making him successful as a reporter and as a columnist especially, and described it in the context of making this deeper relationship, this truly authentic relationship with this park attendant slash blogger. And I was so appreciative that he used that as kind of the opening of the book to then describe by his own life story, in a way, telling a story. That's how his columns are so terrific. Something that I think is a value that Minnesotans understand. Sometimes it's harder. Sometimes we're more shy. Sometimes we're not, necessarily wanting to, we think of it as bragging sometimes, and it's sometimes a story that should be shared. But I'm wondering if others that are with us here today in this book club have their own examples or their own experiences, or if Bernadine, if that resonated with you, that telling that story of deepening a relationship as a learning, sharing process that then made the world a better place.
Well, absolutely. And I appreciate it. About one of the things that I really got a lot of benefit from this book was his reflections retrospectively back on his growing up in St. Louis Park, which at that time was a very white and, kind of known as an anti-Semitic community, and reflecting back now on how multiculturally diverse it is, and with a much more welcoming and many different kinds of people with experiences living in what had once been a very vanilla St. Louis Park, and then helping the reader to see through his examples how the community has benefited from that induced diversity. And when he talks too about going back to Willmar and seeing so many people of color there, and from what had once been a very white and a very homogeneous population as well. I think a big challenge here in Minnesota is for us to authentically appreciate the contributions that our immigrants and refugees who are joining us here bring to our economy, and how really, in many ways, dependent our economy has become on that, on those contributions from our immigrants and refugees. And it was fun to see Tom reflect on that from both the suburban and a rural perspective. I know that one of the things Blandin Foundation is working on very hard these days is to try to help rural communities be more welcoming and feel safer for people regardless of their background and regardless of their heritage. It's an opportunity we have as a state, because if it were not for many of our immigrants and refugees, we'd be seeing population decline in many parts of rural Minnesota. And so the reinvigoration of main streets in southwestern Minnesota and other parts of the state is really thanks in large part to our new neighbors and citizens from other parts of the world.
So you'll have Tom for a presentation. My sense is that he has been thinking a lot about this. I know he was interviewed last week, Larry Jacobs from our Humphrey School, which I also went back and was a participant and graduated from. And Larry Jacobs, used his forum there of his Center on Politics to, ask Tom some, I'd say occasionally some kind of hard question, but, they kind of got a great, energetic conversation. But one of the things I was struck by having that interaction was that it appears that the rest of the world has increased its interest in our part of the world. I'm hoping that our part of the world is keeping up and always advancing in how much we're trying to understand about the rest of the world. But the thing that I noted was that the last 4 years, people have been kind of wondering what's going on in America, and why are we walking away from the institutions that we created after the Second World War? Why are we walking away from allies who we fought side by side with? What's going on? And so one of the answers is, well, we need to know more about this complex place called America. And that's like saying, well, we need to know more about this complex place called the world, or even this complex place called Ethiopia, different kind of regions. But there's an element of the complexity that Tom Friedman embraces and then uses language like why he loves journalism is that he can break down complex things into parts and then make it more understandable. And having a better informed public is a way that democracy can thrive and survive. And so I see the connection of this book to this kind of debate underway. Is our democracy in demise? Democracy doesn't work, et cetera. That the contribution of honest conversations and breaking things down and being willing to tackle complexity because you need to have lots of angles to understand something, that Tom Friedman's book is part of a larger conversation that we could be having on the revitalization and reinvigoration of our democracy, which tackles directly, not kicking cans down the road problems or turning our backs on a problem because it doesn't affect us, or burying our head in the sand, or closing our eyes, see no evil, speak no evil. He's urging us to be slightly less Minnesotan and a little bit more out there, talking about our challenges, talking about our accomplishments, and talking about the things that we're struggling with that we're just not sure.
What I've found so helpful as a framework for coping with the opportunities that we have as a nation is this concept. I think he talks about it as something like dynamic stability. He talks about this, one of his key ideas is this age of acceleration that began, and I think he calls out the year 2007 as the go date for that, new rate of acceleration, and the year that the iPhones came out, we all held computers in our hand. And I think that was the year that Twitter came online. So he puts that marker down. And this idea of increasing remember we used to talk about for a while, this language around the new normal. Well, the new normal is this dynamic Tom labels it dynamic stability, that things are going to continue to accelerate and change and he talks in this book a lot about Moore's law, right? Remember where it was that every 5 to 7 years that technologies become obsolete, this increasing, accelerating obsolescence. So his book is really isn't the subtitle something about an optimist's guide, right, to thriving? And the optimism is the idea that how do we stay on this bucking bronco of dynamic stability is this tool of reflection that we began our conversation talking about, and kind of breathing through it. But for me, one of the key takeaways is that we've got to just buckle up our suspenders and get ready for this ride of technological transformation at a rate we have never seen before. As a species, we got to understand that this is our future, this dynamic stability of technological change. And the best antidote to the disruption of that, the theme that I took away from that is this idea of working together for shared goals. And that's why, Mark, I think your question is so pregnant, because the COVID and in the wake of the civil unrest that we saw here after George Floyd was murdered, I think has created a pause in our culture to ask, what are we centering? Are we centering profits? Are we centering people? And all the while we're riding this bucking bronco of ever accelerating change.
I think we lost Bernadine's voice for a moment. You maybe cannot hear. There, you're back. Thank you.
I'm
Keep
back.
going.
Yep. Mark, I see we've got a comment in the chat box here. Maybe I'll just go ahead and read it out from,
yes.
From Ann Tracy. Ann says that Friedman writes that the biggest disease is isolation. How does or can technology help and hinder the isolation, especially during the pandemic? And how can we use that technology to widen our community, to embrace new Americans, embrace all people who would go to a different coffee shop, even maybe civil conversations with people who might vote differently than we do? Thank you for that, Ann.
I love that question, Ann. And I was thinking about this from Bernadine, what you were saying about being able to handle this kind of rate of speed or the bucking bronco. There were lots of wonderful sort of analogies and ways that Tom Friedman expressed this, but one of them was the notion of learning to ride a bike. At first you fall and bump your knee and bump your head perhaps, but once you go and you get going, then it's like, great, look at this, and you keep moving. And that's an element of where we are. But what we've been forced to do in the COVID moment is to be very physically isolated and then try to figure out how to stay socially connected. And I know that for some people, this has the whole element of not having broadband or not having a computer or not having a phone, that, is the sort of, connection point. And there's work and things are happening. But I've also noticed that people have occasionally then said out loud, we've had family reunions before, and some of us talk to each other and some of us don't, but this time we had to do our family reunion on Zoom or on FaceTime or whatever. And all of a sudden we were able to see and connect with each other differently, or in book clubs or in other ways. So I think that's been one part. But there is no changing the fact that the pandemic separation of ourselves from our loved ones who've gotten sick, and especially our loved ones who've died from this, being unable to actually say goodbye and to make a physical connection. I speak about this with a lot of heart about this. There are things that will affect us out of this moment for a long time. And sharing these hard, difficult things alongside of trying to see the ways that we maybe have socially connected better in some ways over a distance. I think we will take these with us going forward. But there are those who have said out loud, this pandemic is more like a warning, like a reminder of how nature functions. And if you get nature too out of whack with climate disruption or with destruction of biodiversity and forest, and things will happen that will be dramatic and will affect everything from our food to our diseases to our ability to take care of each other. And so finding the ways that we use this danger of isolation, and we've had before the COVID, we had some governments creating ministries of happiness and ministries about isolation. So we know this has been a growing concern, but can we use the intelligence that we have to say we've been warned? Pandemics, epidemics can happen, will happen. What's our preparation? What's our commitment to resilience and sustainability? Do we prioritize the quarterly return, or do we prioritize the long-term sustainability? And I do believe that Minnesotans in general, and Tom Friedman uses examples, but he also sort of makes the case, are open to the idea that we have to think about the problems of isolation, the problems of sustainability, of resilience, and we need to collectively address them because we can't individually. It's the genius of that Paul Wellstone quote. We actually can't all do better unless we all do better when it comes to like changing the climate or when it comes to a pandemic. And so I believe that if we can name it, that we have a crisis, an epidemic of isolation. We have an epidemic at the moment in a mental health arena, especially among young, but among all. Then we can say, we want to do something about it together. What can we do? And I think if we get to that step where we've named our problem, our situation, our condition, and we've said we want to do something about it, then I think we can trust with the open-hearted conversation that we'll come together. When I see in my neighborhood, in my church, in my larger community, the incredibly innovative things that people are doing to help each other or to care for each other, I'm actually quite energized by the possibility that we will continue with these lessons even as our society becomes more safe to interact and all of that, that we're learning some lessons that were about neighborliness and courtesy and social connectivity, that I hope brings us back to that stage going forward.
Yes, and we have to remember as Minnesotans that everybody has to at least have access to the internet and the skills to use it, because as we accelerate into this ever more connected world that Tom describes in this book, people that don't have access to the internet or the skills to use it will be further and further behind, and that will continue to threaten our democracy. Hey, Mark, we've got a question here from William Goins I'm going to read out to you. William writes that Tom has written in the recent past about how Biden administration could revive a past strategy of bringing leaders into key positions from different parties into one administration. Regardless of which party wins on a national level, how can Minnesota be a model of working across the aisle for positive change and innovation that can lead the country and the world as a model? Mark, you were Secretary of State. You've been in elected office. You've had a statewide perch. What would you say back to William?
Well, so number one, I'm very appreciative that this part of Tom Friedman's perspective has been lifted up in this question. Thank you so much for bringing this out. And I mean, I want to, maybe use this as an opportunity to say we need everybody's participation in solving these giant problems. And that means all men and women, all races, all immigration status, everybody. We need everybody, all Democrats, Republicans, Green, Grassroots Party, Independence Party, Constitution Party. We need everyone. So that's easy to say, but what does it require? And so I've noticed that, there have been, some elements of bipartisan conversation about certain issues and some sharp divides within parties about some issues. Trade comes to mind and other things. But I've also noted that there's starting to be, I would say, a better opening or a better consideration or a broader consideration about both the ways that partisanship has divided us in the past that wasn't good, that needs to be stopped and needs to be evaluated, but then how do we go forward? So in my experience as Secretary of State, our job was basically, 2/3 of the staff was registering and helping new businesses, and 64,000 people were creating new businesses in Minnesota every year. All kinds of people, all political persuasions, all colors, all sizes, all shape, all genders. And so you have a huge number of people who, made their work improving their lives and the opportunities for their children. And so they share something deep. And I think we can touch each other through that kind of focus. I know that many people in Minnesota have always remained very interested in their country of origin. We have many Norwegian Minnesota organizations, Swedish, German, Icelandic, and our new Minnesotans have stayed very close in touch with their home countries. And so we've built a kind of a shared crazy quilt of new Minnesotans who are deeply passionate and deeply partisan Minnesotans, and they still speak Norwegian, and they always come to Nordic Thanksgiving, except for this year because they have to cancel it because of COVID. So we have these things that attracted people to Minnesota that then don't have, I came to Minnesota because it's a red state, or I came to Minnesota, it's a blue state, or whatever. We came here for opportunity, for some people for freedom of religion, for some people to flee torture and imprisonment. And so if we can focus on the things that have attracted us to this amazing place we call home, and I want to say there's lots of people on this book club who aren't just Minnesotan, but mostly people who love Minnesota. If we can do that, then we can take Tom Friedman's suggestion that in the critical positions that make policy or that oversee those who are implementing policies, that we think about who's the best fit and what's the most inclusive process for making sure that's very diverse as we make that calculation. Then we have an opportunity to really kind of blast off from this moment. I know as the civilian aide to the Secretary of the Army for Minnesota, that our armed forces are one part of the society that's very diverse. Lots of different people, lots of different views. I'm guessing that our very big companies that we have in Minnesota, very successful worldwide, their workforces, their team members, very diverse points of view and racial and ethnic and all kinds of things. So I think that our bigger institutions are beginning to reflect that kind of diversity and inclusion. Can we see how that gives us that capacity in the larger political sphere? I'm hopeful, and I think Minnesota can help lead the way, because I know people here see that that's the best way for our own state to function.
I'm glad you're hopeful. Thank you for that. What I would add is this idea of one Minnesota. I do think that Minnesota is unique, and I know that our Governor Walz has embraced that as sort of a moniker of his administration. But the idea of one Minnesota and the interconnectedness of rural and Minnesota and urban, and as Paul Wellstone put it, we all do better when we all do better, is pretty deeply baked, I think, in Minnesota. I'll just share a quick anecdote that kind of illustrates that. So some years ago, was maybe like as many as 15 years ago, Blandin Foundation has historically been a funder of Minnesota Public Radio, one of our real assets, along with the University of Minnesota in the state. So that does stitch us together and creates a picture of the whole. And we were, some of our senior leadership was in St. Paul visiting with the president of NPR at the time, and they had done some research that they were sharing with us about their listening audiences nationally, part of a national public radio effort, trying to understand their leader or listeners' identity to place and how they identified themselves. And they found that uniquely Minnesotans identify with Minnesota. Where are you from? I'm a Minnesotan. We have a Vikings team that's a Minnesota Vikings. We have a state of University of Minnesota that serves the entire state. And we have this idea of interdependency and rural urban connections that I think serves us really well and something we can build on into the future to kind of undergird that hopefulness you talked about, Mark, that, unlike other people who may connect to, a city or the South Side or the Bronx or the New England. I mean, we Minnesotans have an identity as a whole state. And I think it's a precious legacy that is unique to us here in the upper Midwest. We stand out. And I'm hoping that that ethos of a one Minnesota, that we see our interdependence, is something that Tom Friedman is, he didn't invent that, right? He's reflecting that out in the book. And I'm glad that in these times of pandemic that we can be reminded of that special, what connects us to one another in our state.
Well, I've had this kind of unique experience of the last few months because I helped bring an exhibit that's now up at the Mall of America. Some of you know where that is, down in Bloomington. But up on the third floor in the North Wing, there's a giant set of, it's an exhibit. It's called When Minnesota Fed the Children of Europe. And it's a story that's 100 years old. It was during the First World War when Belgium was occupied by a German army and the ports were blockaded by the British Navy and people were literally out of food and starving. And, a couple Midwesterners got involved in raising the money and finding the wheat out in the countryside and milling the wheat into flour and shipping it to save millions and millions of lives. And so that story is told from the perspective of school children in Belgium, writing to the school children in America and Minnesota and to these people who made it happen, thanking them for saving their lives. That's an extreme situation, that kind of war and occupation and starvation of, such a huge area. But the ways that Minnesotans came together in the midst of a pandemic 100 years ago, drought 100 years ago, 100,000 or more of our young farmers over in France fighting, we were able to pull together and help to save millions of lives on the other side of the planet. So those are there. Anyone can stop and see them. But I bring this up because it's a reminder that we are sometimes asked to help others in other places because of emergency situations, and we come together. So Minnesotans have a kind of devotion to service, to humanitarian and to social and other kinds of service, educational and medical attention, that brings us together to do an amazing thing. The two leaders, one was Herbert Hoover, who went on to be a president. The other was James Ford Bell, who was running what we now call General Mills. But the fact that we as a people get it together and are able to feed so many people on the other side of the world means that pretty much anything we decide we want to do, how can we help our own state so that everybody has broadband? How can we help our own state so everyone has access to quality education? We can do it if our hearts together say we want to do this together. And thank you to Blandin and Bernardine for having this devotion to broadband. That's one part of the puzzle, but having this idea to get us all together this morning.
And I want to thank you, Mark, and your team at Global Minnesota. I'm really excited for this partnership because we are deeply connected across the state and across the globe. And the organization, your aspirations is a great asset to us in this day. I want to thank you for your leadership as Secretary of State for Global Minnesota and for hosting our book club here today. It was a real treat to be with you, Mark. And in the chat box, I want to thank Ann Tracy for popping in some links. And I hope that folks feel really warmly invited to join us for Tom Friedman's live keynote address to our conference next week. And the other sessions from the conference can be reached through those links in the chats again. So thanks again, Mark, for joining us and hosting this book club with us this morning.
Thank you, Bernadine. And I do recommend those earlier sessions from this broadband conference, but next week, and again, it'll be online, let your friends know. Many of the things that we do at Global Minnesota are also online. You can go see information about this exhibit, Mall of America, World Food Day, all day, incredible presentations, and things that are coming up in the near future, looking at other issues and other opportunities, including some special focus on new things happening with U.S.-Russia relations and others. So again, I want to thank the members of Global Minnesota whose memberships make this kind of opportunity available and possible for the whole world. You can get more information on Blandin Foundation, on Department of Employment and Economic Development, the Broadband Initiative on the website, and also at globalminnesota.org. You can get information about past events, future events, membership, and other opportunities for helping make Minnesota, a Minnesota that's connected to the world and the world connecting to us. So thank you again to everybody and have a good day.
Thank you.